Hi, my name is Effie Nikki, and today we're going to talk about muscle energy. This is one of my favorite topics, so I'll try not to get too excited, but I love talking about cellular respiration. If you've had me for class, you know that. If not, sorry. I hope I won't drive you crazy. Basically, we have to talk about the energy necessary for contraction. So this whole time we've been talking about action potentials and sodium, potassium, and we know that we need ATP in order for our muscles to contract. But we need to look at the sources of how we get ATP. So first here I have just two little bullets saying ATP is the only source used directly for contractile activities. You must have ATP. Hopefully by now we know why. We've looked at muscle contraction. We know that to cock the myosin head you have to have ATP. To release the myosin head you have to have ATP. In order to enter into relaxation you have to be able to pump the calcium back into the terminal cisterna. You need ATP for that. You also need ATP to work your sodium-potassium pump to make sure that you get your sodium back on the outside and your potassium back on the inside once you're trying to relax. So hopefully we realize how important ATP is. We store a little bit of ATP in our cells, but that's depleted in the first 4 to 6 seconds. And we all know that we are working our muscles more than 4 to 6 seconds. So we have to have alternative ways to acquire ATP. So these are the three ways ATP can be generated. There's anaerobic pathway, there's aerobic pathway, there's direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. And these are a little bit out of order because, let me get the pen. Oh, see, giving me trouble already. This one actually happens first. And we'll get to a picture where we look at that in just a second. But first you have, what did I say, 4 to 6 seconds of ATP stored. We use that up first. Then we move to stealing. Then, depending on oxygen, we move into anaerobic or aerobic. Hopefully, if you put an A or an and in front of something, it means not. So this means not oxygen or no oxygen. Aerobic means with oxygen. So we have two pathways to generate ATP. You either are breathing in enough oxygen, and that's aerobic, and you make 36 about ATPs. This is what we know as cellular respiration. The anaerobic pathway, you only make 2 ATPs. This one is used to kind of buy time. So the point I wanted to make was first we use our stored ATP, then we move into direct phosphorylation. We usually then do anaerobic and then aerobic, but you switch back and forth between the two depending on how much oxygen you're breathing. So this is a picture from a different book. I'm sorry, I'm reading the bottom here. I did steal this from an old biology textbook because I like the way that it looks. It says right here, come on, do what I want you to do. I'm having issues today. Mater biology book, so I want to give them credit for it. There's a similar picture in your book. I just happen to like this one a lot better. Okay, so here is the anaerobic. I said anaerobic is without oxygen. So if you're not breathing in enough oxygen, you're going to do anaerobic pathway. You're only going to make 2 ATPs. If you have enough oxygen in your blood, you're going to do the aerobic pathway. You're going to move through all 4 of these steps. Hopefully you looked at this at the beginning. I'd say chapter 2 or 3. I don't remember which one it was in. You move through all 4 of these steps and you make the 2 plus the 34 for a total of 36. So pretty much the dividing point is right here. If you don't have any oxygen, this is all you can do. If you have oxygen, then you're doing this plus this to get a total of 36. So the 2 plus the 34 equals 36. Okay, so let's go back and just look at what I said was the first step. We said first we have 4 to 6 seconds. Get my pen going again before I mess something up. We have our 4 to 6 seconds of ATP. Then this phosphagen system is used. And basically it's stealing. We need a temporary supply of ATP until we can get enough oxygen to start cellular respiration. So obviously it says here it's a fast-acting system that generates ATP. Pretty much what you're going to have is ADP. And I guess I need to go back just a second and make sure we understand how ATP is made. So if you have ATP, if you break it down, you'll have, and it's adenosine triphosphate. If you break it down, you have diphosphate, which means 2 phosphates, and then you have this extra. When you break ATP down into ADP plus P, what comes off? Energy. What do we do with that energy? We use that energy to make our muscles contract. If I want to create ATP, if I have an ADP and I have a phosphate, all I have to do is add energy and I can make ATP. So if I have a bunch of ADPs right here floating around, what do I need to make ATP? I need a phosphate and I also need energy. If I take adenosine diphosphate and a phosphate and energy and smush it all together, I get ATP. So we have creatine phosphate, abbreviated here CP. Creatine phosphate, the phosphate is plucked off by an enzyme called, I'm going to erase this, by an enzyme called creatine kinase. How do I know it's an enzyme? Hopefully you answered because it ends in ASE. So we have creatine phosphate, in comes this creatine kinase, and it plucks off the phosphate, and it adds it to ADP, and also steals some energy with it, so now we have ATP. So what have we done? We've stolen phosphate and energy from creatine phosphate. That's it. Be really careful about some of these words. Sometimes when questions are asked, students forget which one's the enzyme and which one's the one supplying the phosphate. So creatine phosphate is where we're getting the energy and the phosphate from to make ATP. What's the enzyme that's responsible for that action? It's the creatine kinase. So just make sure you have that straight in your head. Okay. Excuse me. Here's figure 9.20 from your book, and it's showing you prolonged exercise, short duration exercise, and this woman actually running. I want to break it down and make sure that we understand what's happening here and then also relate it back to aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Okay, so first here we have, so pick another color. First here we have the ATP that was stored in our muscles. We said that was the first 4 to 6 seconds, right? Okay, after that, we don't have any more stored ATP. We have to resort to stealing. So this is when we're going to use that phosphagen system. So in this part right here, we're taking that creatine phosphate, we're stealing off the phosphate and the energy, and we're using it with ADP to make ATP. In this period or this period, we are alternating between anaerobic and aerobic. So remember, anaerobic is without oxygen, and you get what? 2 ATPs. Aerobic, you have oxygen, you get 36 ATPs. So after we're done stealing, we're usually in anaerobic. When you're running, that first part, you're breathing really hard, you're trying to get enough oxygen to your muscles so that you can turn it into ATP. But in the very beginning, you're probably not breathing deeply enough. So you're usually in anaerobic. After anaerobic, once your breathing catches up with your muscle need, you move into aerobic. You're breathing in enough oxygen to supply to all of your muscles to make enough ATP. But that doesn't mean that when you get into mile 4, when you're sucking wind, that you're still in aerobic. We go back and forth between aerobic and anaerobic the entire time that we're working out. This picture is showing you short duration exercise versus long duration exercise. Here in short duration, it's saying that stored glycogen, which is in your liver, is being broken down into glucose to supply your muscles with the glucose plus the oxygen to be able to turn it into ATP. This picture where it shows prolonged duration, it's also showing you that sometimes we have oxygen stored, myoglobin. So we have oxygen that can be used if we're not breathing in enough oxygen, but this only lasts for a little bit. You have to be able, it's like a stored finite amount of oxygen. You still have to be able to replace that with breathing deeply. So if you go through all of these, what I want you to understand is we store 4 to 6 seconds of ATP. After that, we have to steal from creatine phosphate and be able to explain that process, that we actually take the creatine phosphate molecule, we strip off the energy and the phosphate, we add it to ADP to create ATP. But again, that's only good for about 10 seconds. Then we have to start moving into aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Usually it's anaerobic first, where you're only making 2 ATPs. Then eventually your breathing catches up with your need and you're now making 36 ATPs because you have enough oxygen and you can proceed through anaerobic respiration. So another thing that you should get from this is we're buying time. So we use up our stores, then we start stealing, then we make a tiny little bit of ATP so that we can get through to aerobic. So ideally aerobic respiration is what we want, but we do these little baby steps until we can get to aerobic respiration. On a side note, if you may or may not know this, anaerobic respiration, even though you're making 2 ATPs, the product isn't fully broken down, and this is where we get lactic acid. So if you work out strenuously, you wake up the next morning and your muscles are sore, part of that is from lactic acid accumulation. It's not the entire thing, but for this, let's stick with that. So you work out, you wake up the next morning, you're really sore, that means you have an accumulation of lactic acid in your muscles. How did it get there? It means you spent too much time in aerobic respiration. You were not breathing enough to supply enough oxygen to be able to make those 36 ATPs. When you do aerobic respiration, the only products are water and carbon dioxide. So not quite as sore the next morning if you stayed in aerobic respiration. So for endurance athletes, they really try to monitor their aerobic to anaerobic respiration and make sure that they stay in aerobic as long as possible because they want to be able to work out the next day and the next day and the next day. Okay, let's see where we are. It's not going to behave. There we go. Okay, muscle fatigue. Pretty much if you're unable to contract anymore, this is muscle fatigue. And there's a number of reasons for this. A total lack of ATP rarely occurs. Some of the imbalances here, hopefully if you understand muscle contraction, you could see if you didn't have enough potassium. Remember, sodium's on the outside of the cell, potassium's on the inside of the cell. These guys are coming in and potassium's trickling out. If you don't have enough potassium, or if your electrolyte balance is off, your muscle's not going to be able to fully contract, so that's going to lead to muscle fatigue. Another thing is calcium. What do we need calcium for? If you don't have enough calcium, your synaptic knob doesn't release acetylcholine, you can't put, you don't have enough to release from your terminal cisternae, there's the word. So you can have muscle fatigue due to some of these electrolyte or ionic imbalances. So we have this word called oxygen deficit, and a deficit is you owe something, right? So I put a question up here. Why are we breathing so deeply after we work out? Your body has stopped needing all that ATP, right? You're sitting down, huffing and puffing. Trust me, I know. I run. So I know it doesn't look like it all the time, but I do. So we need this extra oxygen to replenish the stores that we stole from. So you can see right here, I've highlighted everything for you. Oxygen reserves. Remember how I said we stored a tiny little bit of oxygen called myoglobin? We need to put that back. So the next time we need to use it, it's there for us. Glycogen stores. We said sometimes we'll take glycogen and break it down into individual glucoses so that we can use that to burn and make ATP. Well, guess what? You got to store it. You've got to take glucose now, put it back together, store it as glycogen in your liver for the next time you need it. The ATP reserve and the creatine phosphate reserve. So remember that first 4 to 6 seconds of ATP that you had? You have to put that back. The creatine phosphate that you stole the phosphate and the energy from, well, guess what? You have to make those. Because if you didn't, the next time you went to use them, they wouldn't be there. So you wouldn't be able to work out. Remember, we've got like about a 10, 15-second gap where we're using all of these immediate sources. We got to put those back so that next time they're available to us. Let's see. Oh, this last one here. Remember that lactic acid that I was talking about? When it accumulates, it makes your muscles sore. You will have to be able to take that lactic acid and turn it back into glucose or glycogen, which if you don't understand all the processes of cellular respiration, it's a little bit difficult to explain. But pretty much you got to get rid of that lactic acid. If it stays there, it's going to make you sore forever. So there's a mechanism that happens. We need oxygen. We need ATP for that to happen. So basically, what am I saying? Why are we still breathing oxygen? Because we're trying to do what? Create ATP. We're trying to create phosphates and energy to add back to that creatine phosphate. So we're still doing cellular respiration even after you're relaxing. You're still taking sugar and oxygen and breaking it down into ATP so that you have the energy to do all of these things that are listed here in red. I want to make sure that we understand heat production and that this process is not extremely efficient, but it's pretty efficient. So about 40% of the energy that's released in muscle activity is used for work. So when we're talking about the ATP here. So let's say from glucose to ATP, this energy, 40% of it we use. 60% of it is waste. That doesn't sound really good, but this is more efficient than a vehicle. Cars are about 34% efficient. That's why cars get really hot, right? Excuse me. So why is it that you're hot and sweaty when you're working out? 40% of the breaking down of that glucose is being used to generate ATP and to keep your muscles going. 60% of it is being released as heat. That's why you're hot when you're working out. And hopefully we can go back to some of our previous chapters and realize that's why we have to have the ability to sweat, right? So we're heating up anytime we're working and burning glucose and making ATP and working our muscles and contracting our muscles. We have to have a way to cool ourselves off. So hopefully you remember back in the integumentary system, we have our sweat glands, and our sweat glands allow us to sweat. The evaporative cooling or the evaporation of that sweat draws heat away from our body and cools us down so we don't overheat. Okay, come on. This last thing I'm going to talk about is called muscle fiber type. These words will make sense if you know something about cellular respiration. So slow oxidative and fast glycolytic fibers. So we actually have different muscle fiber types. So we keep talking about a muscle in general. We keep talking about, rectus femoris or biceps brachii. But there are specific fibers that make up those muscles. So slow oxidative, I'm just going to list here and highlight abundant mitochondria. Aerobic respiration is what they're adapted for. Fatigue resistant. So mitochondria, myoglobin, that's oxygen, aerobic respiration, so that's with oxygen, and they're fatigue resistant. So this is long term, right? Oxidative is another word for aerobic. You'll hear that with aerobic respiration. So these are slow oxidative fibers. That means these muscle fibers are especially programmed for long-term usage. Glycolytic has to do with the very first stage of cellular respiration, which is the only stage that's used in anaerobic respiration. So these are for quick responses, not fatigue resistant. What would be quick response? You should associate with anaerobic respiration. Poor mitochondria, poor myoglobin, that's oxygen. What's mitochondria? This is the site of aerobic respiration. So we don't have mitochondria, or don't have as many. So not lots of sites for aerobic respiration. We don't have a lot of stored oxygen. We want quick response. So this is short-term muscle fibers. Remember, muscle fibers are made up of proteins. We have our myosin, right? We have our titin. We have our actin. These are proteins. Proteins come from DNA. So there is a genetic component to whether somebody has more slow oxidative fibers or fast glycolytic fibers. So it says down here at the bottom, the ratio of the different fiber types have genetic predispositions. So if you see somebody and they just can run marathons and they don't get fatigued easily, and they're 8 years old, and you can say, wow, he's a born marathon runner. What does that really mean? That means he probably has a ratio of more slow oxidative muscle fibers than he does fast glycolytic fibers. If somebody is a born sprinter, they have quick bursts of energy, they just can't do long term as well. Well, that person probably has a ratio of more fast glycolytic than slow oxidative fibers. So I would go through this and make a little list. Slow oxidative means aerobic respiration, long term, endurance, fatigue resistance. Fast glycolytic, more anaerobic, quick responses, short term exercise. Just to make sure that we understand these two concepts, because people often get them confused. For right now, let's not worry about this other type. There is another type that we can look at, but I don't want to get into it today. I want to make sure that we see slow oxidative, fast glycolytic. These are muscle fibers, right? So here is a fast glycolytic and a slow oxidative. Slow oxidative is more red because it has more oxygen stored, right? So these are going to be the ones that are aerobic, and these are the ones that are going to be anaerobic. And I'm just using that as a general reference. Aerobic, long-term, anaerobic, short-term. The other thing I want to point out is, I keep saying it's genetic, but is some of this trainable? Yes, some of it's trainable. I haven't done any research recently on swapping of fibers. Can you make a slow oxidative into a fast glycolytic? You're born with a specific ratio. Through training, you can train yourself to adapt, but you're still going to have a certain number of slow oxidative and fast glycolytic fibers depending on your genetics. So is it malleable? Yes. Can you completely change all of your muscle fiber types? No. And I think that was it for this lecture. Yes. So we are finished with muscle energy. Hopefully that made sense to you. I'd just go back and review, make sure you understand the difference between aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration. Specifically, I would go back to this picture and make sure that you understand everything that's happening when you would be using the phosphagen system, when you would be using anaerobic, when you would be using aerobic, and then make sure that you understand the difference between aerobic and anaerobic in this picture here. I'll see you next lecture. Thanks. Bye.